Well, good evening, everyone. I hope you're all doing well. I hope everyone is okay. Hope everyone's safe. I love you all. I miss you all. I look forward to us gathering soon. It's very soon indeed. I'm excited to see you all again. The church is going to reopen for worship, for ministry again. But until then, let's continue this ministry of the Word at a distance. If you have your Bibles with you, please open them with me to the book of Acts. The book of Acts. So last week we covered the second major part of that chapter. We saw Paul's wider ministry in the city of Ephesus. We saw an effective contrast between two ministries, between the ministry of Paul on the one hand and the ministry of the Jewish exorcists on the other hand. Well, this week we're finally going to finish Acts chapter 19, 3 weeks in the making. And I've broken down this chapter into two major sections, two major partitions. The first one is a small section. That's going to be verses 21 and 22. And I've called this Paul's Ministry Plans. Paul's Ministry Plans. So let's read these two verses together. It says, "Now after these events, Paul resolved in the Spirit to pass through Macedonia and Achaia, and to go to Jerusalem, saying, After I've been there, I must also see Rome. And having sent into Macedonia 2 of his helpers, Timothy and Erastus, he himself stayed in Asia for a while." Now, if you remember, Paul was in that city that was known as Ephesus, which is in that wider region known as Asia Minor, or that we know today as modern-day Turkey. So after the failure of that Jewish exorcism, which we saw in the second part, the middle part of chapter 19, we see that Paul resolved in the Spirit to pass through Macedonia and Achaia. Now we know that he had been to those regions before because we saw him in the previous parts of Acts. So there's nothing new there. And really those are just the regions west and a little bit northwest of Asia Minor, which is where Paul is currently at in Ephesus. And I think to resolve in the Spirit means that Paul's desires and the desires of the Spirit were in alignment. Paul wanted to do what the Spirit wanted him to do. And it seems that this probably came about through prayer, or it could have been through prophecy, a vision, something else. But in any case, it seems that in some way it was revealed to him by the Spirit that this was what he should do. This is what he was supposed to do. So in any case, we know it's a holy desire, it's a good desire, it's definitely not an evil desire. Then after Macedonia and Achaia, Paul wanted to go into Jerusalem, which we know was basically the capital of both Judaism on the one hand and Christianity on the other hand, especially at the time of writing. However, it also seems to be the case from other New Testament letters, like Romans, that Paul wanted to go back to Jerusalem in order to give them funds because they were being persecuted so heavily in that region as Christians. So in any case, after Jerusalem, Paul wanted to go back west, but really he wanted to go to Rome, which we know is part of Italy, and that doesn't seem to be a place that Paul had visited previously in the book of Acts. And so with those plans, we can say that Paul was definitely wanting to revisit the places he had already been at in order to strengthen the churches, to make them stronger. Also, he wanted to redistribute the funds to the churches in Jerusalem, and likely he wanted to report his ministry to the other apostles as well to keep them updated as to what was going on. Also, we see that Paul wanted to expand his ministry, even beyond Macedonia and Achaia into Italy and likely Spain after Italy. However, what's interesting is that even after these resolutions made in the Spirit, we see that Paul sent out both Timothy and Erastus to go into Macedonia while he stayed in Asia for a while. So even though he wanted to go elsewhere, he didn't do it immediately. Instead, he stayed in place, he ministered there for just a little bit longer while they went and prepared the way for him. And it seems to be the case here, like I said, that Timothy and Erastus were really preparing the way for Paul to go back to these regions. Possibly even they were gathering the money ahead of time for him so that he could send it off to Jerusalem. But notice that they're actually called as helpers or his assistants. And so basically they would assist Paul and there would be extensions of Paul's ministry. So that's that first little section there. It's really quick, really easy to understand. At this point, I'd like to bring out just a few applications. First is that it's okay to travel elsewhere and to expand one's ministry. But just to balance that, we should make sure that our desires and our resolutions are in accordance with the Spirit's will. That's actually what the Spirit wants us to do. That we're not just doing it just because we want to do it. Also, we make sure that the motivation of this travel and this ministry is really the spread of the gospel and the glory of God's name, and not the spread of our own name and the glory of our own name. And I think that's a real temptation for ministers today. I think many are very much so tempted to minister for their glory, for their fame. But the truth is that ministry should be about Christ. It should be about His kingdom, not about ourselves, not about building up our own little miniature kingdoms. Second, we see here that it's okay to have helpers in ministry. Paul was an apostle, and yet he had multiple helpers, including Timothy, including Erastus. And they seemed to be sent by Paul to go to other areas to minister where Paul couldn't be at the time. And so I think it's okay for pastors, for various other ministry leaders today to have assistants, to have helpers who are extensions of their ministry. Not only is this an efficient means of performing ministry, of getting ministry done, but also effectively equips the next generation who will inevitably take over at some point in the future. So moving forward, now that we've seen Paul's ministry plans, the chapter is actually going to take a good bit of a turn here, both in its emphasis on what it's talking about, but also on its tone. So if we had music playing in the background of this, right about you'd hear some somber music playing. Because we're going to see an account of persecution that really rises up in Ephesus. And so we're moving into this second section of this last part of the chapter, and we'll cover this in pieces as we go because it's a little bit longer of an account, but I don't think you guys are going to have any problem with that. So first is going to be verse 23. It says, "About that time there arose no little disturbance concerning the way." So the timing here seems to be sometime around when Paul sent off Timothy and Erastus. It was obviously whenever he was still in Ephesus. We know that. We see that there arose no little disturbance concerning the way. And no little means there was a great big disturbance concerning the way. And that will be confirmed later in this account. And the way we've seen before, that's just another phrase for Christianity. For those who follow Jesus, who is the way and the truth and the life. So, in other words, what we see here is that there is a great disturbance about Christianity that came up around the time Timothy and Erastus were sent out. So that's a little bit just an introduction to this account. Now we're going to see the introduction of a new character. That's going to be in verse 24. It says, "For a man named Demetrius, a silversmith, who made silver shrines of Artemis, brought no little business to the craftsmen." Now that seems a good bit interesting, but that word "for" there actually signals to us that Demetrius is the reason for this disturbance. He's the one who instigated it, he's the one who started it, he's the one who caused it. And we see there that he's a silversmith, which obviously means that he fashions things out of silver. And so he was a tradesman, likely a very wealthy tradesman from this industry. And particularly we see that he made silver shrines of Artemis, which basically means that he made idols for the temple and for the people, so they could then use them to perform worship to the false gods and goddesses who were seen to be out there, the Greco-Roman gods and goddesses. But here particularly it was Artemis that he constructed idols for, because the temple of Artemis was in Ephesus, which we'll talk a little bit more about later. And we see that Demetrius actually brought business to other craftsmen in the region as well. And indeed, we know that often one trade relies on another trade in order to accomplish their business. I can think of how houses need carpenters and plumbers and electricians and several other tradesmen in order to actually get built, in order to get finished. I can also think of how books, you need a writer, you need editors, you need a designer, you need printers, and you need several other different trades in order to get them made and distributed and sold. It's just the way the world works. It's how products are made. It's all interconnected, interdependent. Now, I want you to just think with me here for a minute. Okay, why would a silversmith who makes idols create a disturbance over Christianity? And just to get this move along here, let me ask you a few questions, which I think will really help us understand why here. So first is, how many gods do Christians worship? The answer is one, right? The triune God of the Hebrew and Greek scriptures. So here's the second question. How many gods and goddesses did the Romans worship? Many of them, right? They had a bunch of gods and goddesses, and none of them included the God of the Hebrew and Greek scriptures. Here's another question. If the Romans were converted to Christianity, how many idols did they need? The answer is 0, because God always has forbidden images being made of himself. And so he doesn't want Christians to make an image of him and to worship those idols, those images. So here's the last question. How much business would these tradesmen stand to lose from the widespread state of Christianity? And the answer is quite a bit, right? They would lose quite a bit of money, quite a bit of business. So at this point we can see how Christianity was a threat. It was a threat to their livelihood. And that is why they created this massive disturbance, or no little disturbance as the texts like to call it. So let's see how that unfolds. First we're going to see exactly how Demetrius instigated it. And that's in verses 25 through 27. It says, "These he gathered together with the workmen in similar trades and said, 'Men, you know that from this business we have our wealth. And you see and hear that not only in Ephesus, but in almost all of Asia, this Paul has persuaded and turned away a great many people, saying that gods made with hands are not gods. And there is danger not only that this trade of ours may come into disrepute, but also that the temple of the great goddess Artemis may be counted as nothing, and that she may be deposed from her magnificence, she whom all Asia and the world worship.'" So first we see our Demetrius, he gathered the craftsmen that he utilized for his business, and he gathered other workers in similar trades as well to come together. And then he delivers this speech to them, right? Within that speech, he first recognized that their wealth came from this idol fashioning business. And that's obviously a no-brainer. And Ephesus was known for the temple of Artemis. It was known for these gods, and so a lot of people would travel and buy these gods, these idols, give them to the temple, as a sacrifice, as an offering, as a gift. And so this was how they made most of their money. And so obviously they can say, this is where our wealth came from the idol making business. Second, he recognized that Paul has persuaded many people across Asia, not just Ephesus, to turn away from those gods, saying that they weren't really gods. Now, it's fascinating to me personally that a tradesman could recognize this widespread evangelism and conversion. It almost makes me think that Paul could have become a common name or a household name for the Asians, and especially for the Ephesians. So even he knew of Paul and of this Christian movement and of these people who were turning away from their Greek gods and goddesses to worship this one God, this so-called Jesus, who was, crucified and killed and buried, and then rose again supposedly. So it's interesting to me that he recognized that. Third, he said that not only that their trade is threatened by Paul, but also that the temple of Artemis is threatened as well. And really, if we just think about it for a minute, if Paul's theology did become widespread, and their idols and their temple were seen as non-existent, basically, just as images made up by men, then it makes sense to say that it would become disreputable, because then it would all be seen as fraudulent, right? That temple was made for a god who doesn't exist. All these idols are made for a god who doesn't exist. It would be fraudulent, right? And so that business would become disreputable, and the temple become disreputable because it doesn't really exist. So we can understand what he's saying here because he's right. Fourth, he said that Artemis herself could be counted as nothing and deposed from her position of magnificence, really from her position of worship, she whom Asia and all of the world worshipped. So again, Demetrius is right. He's taking this logic, he's making it reach its logical conclusions to say, look, this is bad news for us. This is bad news for our business. It's bad news for our temple. It's bad news for the worship of Artemis. We got to do something about this. So he's right. Paul is a threat to their business, to their temple, which was well known as an absolutely gorgeous temple in the ancient world. In fact, it was one of the 7 wonders, 7 marvels of the ancient world. It was huge and it was beautiful. It was absolutely gorgeous. And also it was a threat to the worship of their favorite goddess. So if we just put ourselves in their shoes just for a minute, this all makes sense to us, right? This speech would make us feel both scared and outraged, scared for our livelihood, which a lot of people understand right now with the pandemic. Livelihood is very important, and it's scary whenever it gets threatened. But also, they were just outraged at the sacrilegious views of Paul. I mean, how dare he suggest that these idols aren't real, that these gods and goddesses don't exist? That's insane. It's an outrage. So if we put ourselves in their shoes, we understand exactly why Demetrius is concerned, why he's angry. And we can go ahead and predict how these men are going to respond as well, which is that they're going to join him in being angry. They're going to join him in being scared. So that's what we see next in verse 28. It says, when they heard this, they were enraged and were crying out, "Great is Artemis of the Ephesians." So again, that was to be expected. They were angry, they were enraged, they were furious. And notice what they say there. Great is Artemis of the Ephesians. They perform worship. That seems to be what angers them the most. The sacrilege against their goddess, against Artemis. How dare Paul question her greatness, even her existence? How dare he? Now, let me ask you a question here. If you get an angry group of men together, what can be the result? A mob. And that's what we're going to see next in verse 29. So the city was filled with confusion, and they rushed together into the theater, dragging with them Gaius and Aristarchus, Macedonians who were Paul's companions in travel. Now that word confusion there does mean literal confusion, but can also mean disorder. It seems to be the case there in the text that there was chaos. There was uproar in the city, which we know was sparked by these tradesmen in the text. The result is that they rushed into the theater, which was not only a place of entertainment, but was also a place for politics. So obviously they wanted something to be done about Paul and Christianity. And by the way, it's believed that this theater could have held as much as 25,000 people. So it was a massive theater. We could consider it something like a stadium that we have today. And the next thing we see is that they actually dragged in Gaius and Aristarchus into this theater. Now, these are characters we haven't seen before, but it's said that they were Macedonians who traveled with Paul. And again, Macedonia was a region west of the city of Ephesus and even west of the region of Asia where all of this was taking place at the moment. So it seems to me that they dragged foreign Christians into their theater simply because they traveled with Paul, who we know spread this anti-idolatrous message and who threatened their livelihood and their worship. So it does not look good for these two, does it? Well, what about Paul? Let's read verses 30 and 31. But when Paul wished to go in among the crowd, the disciples would not let him. And even some of the Asiarchs, who were friends of his, sent to him and were urging him not to venture into the theater. So when Paul either saw this mob or heard about this mob, we see that he wanted to go in, presumably to draw the attention away from Gaius and Aristarchus onto himself, and presumably try to put a stop to all of the madness, to what seems to be just a mob. So this was a noble thing, right? It was a noble thing for him to want to do. But we see there that the disciples wouldn't let him do it. The fellow Christians wouldn't let him do it. And at this point, we almost want to ask, well, why not? It's likely because they knew Paul would get killed if he went in there. And if he went in there even tried to prevent these other two from being killed, he probably wouldn't be successful with that either. So all around, this was not a good idea. As bad as it would be for Paul's companions, it would be far worse for him if he went in there. So they said, no, you can't do it. We're not letting you in there. And what's interesting is that even some of the Asiarchs sent, a message to Paul basically urging him not to go into the theater either. And if you didn't know, Asiarchs were those who had political power in the wider province known as Asia. So these were very politically connected men, which is interesting because it shows that Paul had friends in high places, even in the city of Ephesus, or really beyond the city of Ephesus. So even they knew that if Paul went in there, it would get out of hand. And it's likely something even they couldn't control themselves. So through the care of friends, through the wisdom of Paul's Christian friends, disciples, he was prevented from going into that theater. And so we're still left with the question, well, what's going to happen? Sorry, verse 32. Now, some cried out one thing, some another, for the assembly was in confusion, and most of them did not know why they had come together. So again, it shows that confusion we saw earlier was not just chaos. It was not just disorder. It was also genuine confusion. The assembly was not united on what their concerns were. And they didn't even know why they all came together. It's just that they were loud at the same time, and they were mad at the same time, which is a little bit funny. It would be even more funny if it wasn't such a dangerous account. So let's keep reading this in verses 33 and 34. Some of the crowd prompted Alexander, whom the Jews had put forward, and Alexander, motioning with his hand, wanted to make a defense to the crowd. But when they recognized that he was a Jew, for about 2 hours, they all cried out with one voice, "Great is Artemis of the Ephesians." And again, if it wasn't so dangerous, this would be very comical. So some of the crowd prompted Alexander to get up there and speak. We don't know much about him, but he had to be some kind of prominent Jew, some kind of gifted orator for them to say, hey, you need to get up and say something. And there's a few possibilities as to what was happening here. Either there were some Jews who were also opposed to Paul, who wanted to take advantage of the opportunity, or is that they knew that this rage was against the anti-idolatry that was being communicated by Paul, and they knew that as Jews they don't worship Artemis either, and so they were trying to say, hey, we're not part of this. We're okay with you guys doing your thing, just let us do our thing, don't kill us. So those are two possibilities. Either way, Alexander stood up to represent the Jews. He motioned to the crowd, he tried to get their attention, and he wanted to speak, but as soon as they recognized that he was a Jew, they shut him down. It's like they thought, we don't belong to the way, but we don't like those Jews either, so neither of you are going to speak. And instead, they just shout and they chant, "Great is Artemis of the Ephesians! Great is Artemis of the Ephesians! Great is Artemis of the Ephesians!" And it says that they did that for 2 hours, which again is just a little bit comical. It's a little bit funny to me. But again, we're left to the question, well, what's going to come from all this? What's going to happen here? So let's see what happens when a real leader actually gets involved. This is verses 35 through 40. And when the town clerk had quieted the crowd, he said, "Men of Ephesus, who is there who does not know that the city of the Ephesians is the temple keeper of the great Artemis, and of the sacred stone that fell from the sky? Seeing then that these things cannot be denied, you ought to be quiet, and do nothing rash. For you have brought these men here, who are neither sacrilegious nor blasphemers of our goddess. If therefore Demetrius and the craftsmen with him have a complaint against anyone, the courts are open, and there are proconsuls. Let them bring charges against one another. But if you seek anything further, it shall be settled in the regular assembly. For you are really in danger of being charged with rioting today, since there is no cause that we can give to justify this commotion." So the town clerk comes into the picture, and we can really liken this to a mayor. Right? He was a person of importance, a person of political power. He was basically the chief administrator of the city. So he quiets the crowd down, and then he addresses them. And in that address, first he basically says, who doesn't know about the temple of Artemis and the sacred stone here? So in other words, everyone knows about our temple. Everyone knows about our worship of Artemis. Everyone knows then the stone they believe came from the gods, which was likely a meteorite, by the way. Everyone knows about our worship. So why do you keep shouting out about Artemis? This is just a little bit silly. Second, he tells them that in light of this, they should be quiet. They should do nothing rash. So in other words, you better calm down the mob. You better not kill these Christians. You better not kill any Jews either. Cool your jets. You are blowing this way out of proportion. Third, he says, the men that you've brought here haven't done anything sacrilegious or blasphemous towards our goddess. Which could mean that Gaius and Aristarchus, Paul's companions here, weren't really Christians, which I don't believe is the case. Or it could mean that they were Christians who just didn't say the things that Paul has said, which I think is much more likely to be the case. But either way, they're wanting to take out these two men because of something that someone else said, because of something that someone else did, particularly Paul. And we all know that's just not right. It's not appropriate. It'd be like taking out two teachers because of something a principal says. It'd be like taking out two deacons because of something a pastor said. To quote one of my favorite movies, That don't make no sense. It's just, that's silly. It's inappropriate. It's not right. It's wrong. Which is basically what he's saying there. And then fourth, the clerk basically calls out Demetrius and the tradesmen. He said if they've got a complaint, they've got courts and proconsuls and the regular assembly for that. So if you want to make charges, you got to go through the proper channels. But this mob that you've created is absolutely unacceptable, and it can't happen. And then lastly, he provides a warning, which is that we're all in danger of being charged for rioting today. So in other words, you want to lay a charge against Paul and company, fine, you can do that, but you got to do that through the proper channels. But I can tell you right now, they haven't done anything to deserve this riot, to deserve this mob. But this mob has done something wrong. You have gathered in a way that is improper, really in a way that's illegal. This is not the courts, this is not the regular assembly, this was just made up out of thin air by angry people. So, in other words, you all are in danger of getting charged yourselves. So cut it out. So effectively, we can say the town clerk puts this massive mob in their place. They want blood, but if they keep it up, it's their own blood that's going to be spilled. These Christians have not broken the law, but the mob is in danger of breaking the law themselves. Indeed, we know that rioting was looked down upon in the empire for obvious reasons. If you allow riots, it can come back to you and destroy the empire. So not only would it bring much disrespect to the city, but it could also bring, the emperor and his soldiers and his army to the city and bring punishment and even take away their autonomy. So this was a big deal. This was a serious warning, which they all understood, because we're going to see how they respond next in verse 41. And when he had said these things, he dismissed the assembly. So the town clerk effectively dismissed it. They seemingly got wise, and then they went away. And so the end result is that Paul's friends didn't die, and Paul himself didn't die. So we get a relatively happy ending to this account. And it's a good thing, right? Because it was pretty scary to have this crowd come up out of nowhere, look for Paul, grab these two men instead, and it looks like they're going to be killed. But instead, the mob gets put down and sent away, and Paul and his companions are fine, and they're free to really to go on as they please. So it's a relatively happy ending. At this point, I'd like to bring out just a few applications. First is that Christianity will encounter frightening disturbances. And we've seen this throughout the book of Acts. Paul has definitely seen a number of these disturbances because of his evangelistic ministry. Now, it normally occurs at the hands of the Jews. We've seen that. But it can also happen at the hands of the Gentiles, which is what happened here. So in this case, it was the Ephesian tradesmen who started a disturbance because they saw a threat to their livelihood. They saw a threat to their worship. And so I need to make this clear. Don't expect Christianity, to be without persecution. Don't expect Christianity to always be an easy life. Because the truth is that we can be hated by the unbelieving world around us. We can be targeted, attacked, and even killed by the unbelieving world around us. In fact, it's still happening today. There are Christians being martyred today. I read headlines just about it from Nigeria. It's still happening. So don't be surprised if this kind of thing comes. Instead, prepare yourself for it. And know that in the end, Jesus is worth the hatred. Jesus is worth the suffering. He's worth death, because we get the eternal kingdom. We get eternal life. We get eternal rewards. And it's not even worth comparing to the suffering. Second, we see that Christianity is a threat to idolatry. So Christianity threatened the idol-making industry of the first century, and it still does today. It's just that our culture's idols look different than they did back then. So their idols were literally statues in temples to supposed gods and goddesses who were out there. Our culture's idols takes the form of anything that really interferes with Christian worship and with Christian obedience. And there's so many modern idols today that there's really too many to list. But I'll just give some examples. So they had temples that they used to perform worship. Our culture has stadiums, offices, and stores that we use for false worship. They had gods that were objects of their false worship. Our culture has athletes and businessmen and designers and politicians that we falsely worship. And that's not even including all the different objects that we look to for fulfillment, or all the ideologies that flatly contradict Christianity. So we can say that Christianity definitely was a threat to their system. It was a threat to their religion. It was a threat to their spirituality. It was a threat to some of their livelihoods. And the same is true today. Christianity is a threat to the system of the unbelieving world. And unbelievers recognize this. Whenever they hear the gospel, whenever they hear Christian ethics, they can see that it is a threat to their beliefs, to their way of life. This is why Christianity is being targeted so much in the media and movies and shows, as well as on social media platforms, because people rightly see that Christianity is a threat to their beliefs and to their lifestyles. Third, we can say that God can show Christians mercy through unexpected means. Let me repeat that. God can show Christians mercy through unexpected means. Now, Paul wanted to step in. He wanted to try to stop this madness himself. But his fellow Christians and his seemingly pagan friends wouldn't let them. And they were probably wise to do that. But God did put a stop to it. And he used one of their own people to do it. God used the town clerk to speak wisdom to this foolish mob. And God used the town clerk to dismiss this angry mob. And the result is that Paul and his two companions survived. God was merciful. And he can show us a similar mercy if we find ourselves in frightening disturbances like this. So that brings chapter 19 to an end. We saw Paul's plans, and we saw persecution in Ephesus that no doubt encouraged Paul to travel elsewhere after this. In the end, we can say that the gospel goes forth and that it saves people. We can say that because it happened to such an extent that Demetrius and his fellow tradesmen were concerned about their livelihoods that were earned from pagan religion. So it's obvious that the gospel went forth and it saved many people. And we can also say that God is merciful to deliver Christians. We can say that because he delivered Gaius and Aristarchus and Paul from possible death. So God is gracious to save unbelievers, and God is merciful to deliver Christians. And that concludes our study for this week. Again, I love you all. I miss you all. I look forward to seeing you again. I'm very excited about the prospect of gathering together for worship, for ministry. I look forward to seeing you all who can come on Sunday. In the meantime, stay faithful. Good evening.